Okay, this video is for biosecurity, and we're going to be talking about ballast water and its role as a vector in international shipping around the world. Okay, what's ballast water? Why is it used? So what we have here is a longitudinal cross-section of a modern bulk carrier, and the section marked in gray are normally filled with water ballast when the holds are empty. And so as cargo is delivered to the ship pumps out the water ballast into the receiving waters of the port, and they have more or less of these depending on the size of the ship. And that's in order to balance the boat so that it remains stable and moves through the water in the most efficient way. Okay, and the most efficient way is at with the water line just above the bulb, the bow bulb. So these things, obviously, if it's going to be loaded back here, say you have a big load of iron ore, then you're going to have to counterbalance that with water up the front. And there are tanks on the side, on the starboard side, on the port side, in order to counter a balance of a heavy load on one side or the other. Because all shipping containers aren't going to weigh exactly the same thing. Alright, and so the transfers of these water now represent the single largest source of invasive, non-indigenous aquatic species pretty much into every country in the world that has a port, besides the landlocked ones. Probably the most invasive species are coming through ballast water. Okay, so why is ballast water such a great medium for marine creatures? If we think about the life histories of marine organisms, and for the most part when we talk about invasive species with ballast water, we're talking about marine invertebrates. Think back to your invertebrate biology courses that you've had. And the aquatic ones, generally when it's time to reproduce, if they're reproducing sexually, will just there'll be some sort of environmental cue, and then they'll all just go and spew up all their sperm and eggs into the water column, which they'll find each other, and then they have a larva which swims around in the water and waits until it finds the right environmental cues to settle, and that could be the sound of a reef, or it could be a chemical cue or a water temperature or something like that. And so then they'll settle, and it could be a few hours, or it could be months and months and months, up to a year and a half for crayfish. It would take a year and a half before they'd settle out. Okay, and these are what they're called larval dispersal phases, which makes sense evolutionarily speaking, because you don't want to compete with your offspring. If you want to give them the best chance of survival and yourself the best chance of survival, you hopefully have your babies spread far and wide, so that a lot of them will find other suitable habitat without trying to take up your own resources. So that's the reproductive strategy for most marine invertebrates. And so when they have when ballast water is sucked up into these tanks, a lot of times these things are uniquely adapted to stay in that water column for quite a long time until they're spewed out in the next harbor. And if we think about changes to shipping over the last 50 years that have increased the flow of these things, obviously there's a lot more shipping going on than there was in years past. So we've got a whole lot more water being moved around the world, and the ship speeds have increased. So the ship speeds have gone up from an average of maybe it used to take 2 months to get across the Pacific Ocean from say Singapore to Los Angeles or San Francisco. Now it might only be 3 weeks. So a lot of things that would have starved to death or died in transit are now surviving. So an estimation between 10 and 90 billion tons of water per year is taken in and discharged. So that's quite a wide discrepancy between the top and the bottom ranges. So 10 billion to 90 billion tons. So that's 10,000 billion liters of water, to maybe to 90,000 billion liters of water. So it's a lot of water, but we don't know exactly how much is being moved. At this estimate, up to 80,000 tons of seawater per bulk freight carrier can be discharged in port while loading. So something like 90 times the pool at the aquatic center. So has this actually manifested itself in any way? Let's look at Port Phillip Bay in Australia. There was a survey done in 2004 or 5, and what they did was just go out and try to sample in lots of different ways and count how many species they could find, every way they could think of to count species. So they found between 300 and 400 species in total. 160 of them were new. So a lot of those were, a third of those had never been seen before in Port Phillip Bay. Okay, that doesn't mean that they hadn't been there before. Maybe they'd been overlooked. But 13% of all species found were invasive. Okay, so this doesn't even include the plankton, which probably contains lots and lots of exotic species. But we can't really even begin to estimate the numbers and rates of introduction because so little is known about the planktonic assemblage really anywhere. You could do this. You could say the same for the Bay of Plenty waters. Okay, the Tauranga Harbour, the same type of survey was done. This was in 2002 or 3. Okay, 316 species were found, 202 species native, 114 non-native or not previously found in this area. Again, it doesn't mean that they weren't always there, but they hadn't been noticed before. This was an extensive survey, but a good portion of those would have been invasive, non-native species that would not have been in Tauranga Harbour had it not been for shipping. And Tauranga Harbour, of course, is the busiest port in New Zealand in terms of number of containers and tonnage of freight. So this is having impacts even locally here. We won't spend time on this video going through all of these cases. You can read these individual episodes of introduction of invertebrates that are attributed to ballast water, and if you want to find more information, you can Google these things. But there are obviously a lot of cases of known invasions by species through ballast water. But we'll look at a couple of the really serious ones. Okay, so this little guy here, Mnemiopsis leidyi, is what's called a comb jelly, or a ctenophore. And if we look at the way this thing is constructed, it's a little filter feeder. It swims through the water, looks like a jellyfish, but it's not a jellyfish, it's a ctenophore. And it's got these rows of cilia, no tentacles. Well, some of them actually have tentacles, but they're not tentacles like a jellyfish. They've got these rows of cilia which beat and move the animal through the water, so they're like little paddles, and what's the word that I'm looking for? Refract the light, and so you get these beautiful rainbow patterns going up and down on these little things. But anyway, they were introduced into the Black Sea, and they sexually mature in 2 weeks, and they can produce 8,000 eggs a day. So at the greatest point of their exponential increase in the Black Sea, when they were released, they were doubling in size. The population was doubling in size every day. So by 1990, a year after they were, or 2 years after they were initially seen, there were an estimated 500 Mnemiopsis in every cubic meter of water. So that translated to 1 billion tons of comb jellyfish clogging the Black Sea. Okay, so about equal to the biomass of all the fish caught in all the oceans of the world every year. So huge amount. And these things eat zooplankton. Okay, and that's including pelagic fish eggs, larvae, and so with these things clearing the water of zooplankton, including the fish larvae, the adult fish didn't have anything to eat because they were outcompeted. There were so many of these filtering the water out that there was no food for the adult fish, and the offspring were getting eaten before they had a chance to grow. So, not surprisingly, the fisheries collapsed, and thousands and thousands of people were put out of work due to this predator. Now, since that time, there's been a predator on these things that has been released into the Black Sea. Whether it was through ballast water or deliberately, nobody really knows. But it was it has been released from the Mediterranean into the Black Sea, and so these things aren't nearly as much of a problem, and the fishery is coming back. But that was a serious economic downturn for quite a while based on this invasion. All right, zebra mussels. These are a small mussel that came from Russia, worked its way through the canals of Europe, and then was loaded into a freshwater port into ballast water in Europe, and then transferred to the Great Lakes. And now, as you can see, they will encrust every available hard surface that they can land on. And so you can see these pipes are just clogged up, and it makes sense because if you're a mussel, a filter feeder, what your most important, the most important thing that you can have is a fresh source of water. And so if you've got a water intake pipe, then it's naturally bringing a fresh supply of food to you without you having to do anything. So that's a brilliant place to live, and not very many predators way down inside of a pipe. And that was a problem anyway. In the Great Lakes, there were no predators for zebra mussels, and there still really aren't many predators that have adapted to start eating these things. And just anecdotally, when I was a kid diving in the St. Lawrence River, or just swimming in the St. Lawrence River, the visibility would be a couple of meters, and now my father scuba dives there regularly and says it's often 20 meters plus. So that's just through the action of the filtering of zebra mussels. So they've changed the turnover time of the water to faster than the plankton reproduce. And so for tourism and diving, it's fantastic, but it's seriously impacted the ecology of the local area. Okay. Here's the Northern Pacific sea star. Two were first noticed in 1995 in Port Phillip Bay in Victoria. And by 2000, in 5 years, it was estimated there were 165 million of these in the bay. Okay, so they were blamed for the decrease in flatfish numbers, serious decline of shellfish, a scallop fishery pretty much disappeared because the scallops didn't have an escape response to these predators that they hadn't evolved with, and so there have been serious economic implications for this one. And so lots of them have been found on mussel lines in Tasmania. We really don't want these ones in here. These are on our top 6 most unwanted species list for marine species in terms of the biosecurity list. And because, if they wound up decimating mussels on commercially grown mussels, it could that could mean the end of a multi-million-dollar business in New Zealand. Okay. So each of these females of these northern Pacific sea stars can produce up to 20 million eggs in a year. So prolific breeders. Okay, and it's just as a funny aside, when they've gone out and done sea star collection days in order to try to, just scuba diving clubs and the like have gone out and tried to collect these things and just try to remove a few of them. They've actually collected the wrong species and wound up killing a whole lot of 11-armed sea stars that actually may even eat these things. Okay. Here's one that's a non-invertebrate. It's an algae, Undaria pennitifida. Okay, it's been found in the Tauranga Harbour, first found in 1987 in Wellington Harbour. Probably came in on the hull of the boat rather than ballast water, but we're not really sure. And it's the doc calls it gorse of the sea. And so you will be, this is what you were looking for last year in Southeast Bay at Mayor Island. I think you learned about it a little bit. If the Marinies would have learned a bit about this last year, but it's what you eat if you eat wakame, the green seaweed salad, and so now it's actually being looked at as possibly a potential aquaculture species because it's really considered to be non-eradicatable at this point. I suppose that eventually it will just compete with and either reach, it'll compete with bull kelp and Aclonia and either reach an equilibrium or outcompete one of the others, or it could be Lawsonia or something else. Seems to occupy about the same habitat. Here's a nice picture of it on a yacht from Littleton Harbor. So we've seen a few invasive species, and so the consequences of these things being released: loss of biodiversity, loss of jobs, loss of exports, lower investment in businesses that may be impacted by these organisms, high cleanup and maintenance. So the zebra mussels in North America nearly create a $1 billion a year cleanup cost. So that all comes right out of people's pockets. All right, and since we are a signatory to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, it says that we shall take all measures necessary to prevent, reduce, and control the intentional or accidental introduction of species. And you can read the rest of that, but we, by law, need to try to mitigate new species coming in, and that includes through ballast water. So what are we doing in order to try to limit these things from coming in? And this is the exercise that we've done in class. Hopefully that you will be doing or have done in class, depending on when you're watching this video. So hopefully you can think about all of the methods that we've already discussed or will be discussing in class, and look at the idea of how much money that you need to throw at them in order to try to mitigate this issue. Now, all of these methods have been tried on a limited experimental basis, but nothing has been widely implemented. So onboard heating, ultrasound, pH, biocide shock. Biocide's a chemical substance that's capable of killing living organisms, and usually selectively. So usually it kills certain ones, like you may have heard of rotenone, which kills everything with gills but leaves everything else alive in a lake, okay, or freshwater. So you can kill all the fish but leave a lot of the insects alive in a lake if you want to get rid of an invasive species in a lake of fish. Okay, chlorination, oxygen deprivation, discharge to shore, organic chemicals, ozone, filtration, heavy metal ions, irradiation, and photochemistry. So try to go through there if you really want to use your brain, and I hope you do. Then go through and just see what try to think about the logistics of each of these methods. All right, so these are the approved methods in New Zealand. Okay, so ballast water exchange in deep water outside the coastal water influence. Okay, so that means boats coming from, say, Singapore to New Zealand, where they take on ballast water, or they'll take on ballast water, let's say, in Singapore, and then they'll change that water as they're underway in the middle of the ocean once they get outside a couple hundred miles from the coastal water influence. And then they hopefully the plankton that lives in the open ocean is not going to be the type that's going to cause problems in that maybe it's even coming from the open ocean in tropical water. Hopefully that's not the type of water that's going to, the organisms that are going to cause problems in a coastal area of New Zealand or any other coastal area. It's quite different habitats. Okay, so you could use fresh water in the ballast tanks, salinity of 2.5 parts per thousand. Nobody currently has facilities to load up boats with fresh water. You can use an improved onshore treatment facility, so you can discharge your water to a treatment facility. None of those have been actually approved yet, so that's not really an option, even though it's an approved option. Use of approved in-tank treatments, and again, none of those have been approved yet, so again, we've got a non-option option. And finally, discharge into approved low-risk zone. So none of those who actually have been approved yet. So that's discharging your water into an area that is not ecologically sensitive. So if you can find me one of those, then fantastic. I'll be quite surprised. Anyway, estimated 36% organism survival rate using the deep water exchange. Okay. This is something that's being built and trialed in around the Great Lakes. Well, it hasn't really been trialed. Models have been built and trialed, but no full-scale ships have been built in this way yet. But it's a ballast-free one, and what you have is you build these tubes into it, so the water can sit in these tubes, and it continuously flows in as the boat is moving through the water, and then there's a continuous exchange. You're never actually keeping any organisms within that bulk carrier's cavities, and the water comes out through the outlet. And because there's a more laminar flow past the screws, the propellers of the ship as it goes out the stern, then it may be much more efficient. There's less turbulence around the props, and the fuel savings could perhaps cut cargo costs. So that's quite a high estimate of $3 a ton, but it could be a great fuel saver in the long run. All right, so legislation in New Zealand around ballast water was passed for voluntary compliance in 1996. Mandatory in 1998, and so now what you have to do is do some paperwork and report that your ballast water procedures were followed. So that's quite a toothy bit of legislation, isn't it? Yeah, they have to say that you've followed the rules. Okay. Nobody actually goes and checks to see whether the ballast water has been exchanged. Reporting requirements are that the location and volume of the ballast water loaded in other ports, the location, volume, method, and duration of deep water transfer, the location, volume, and date of discharge in New Zealand. All right, so that's what you have to put down on your paperwork. Although you don't have to do that if the weather conditions on the voyage in combination with the construction of the vessel precludes exchange. Okay, so, or if the construction of your vessel precludes ballast water exchange. So if you don't think it's safe to transfer water when you're coming to New Zealand or from another country, and then you don't have to do it, and then you can still dump your ballast water in New Zealand. So there's really very toothless, limited controls on getting ballast water, keeping ballast water from coming into the country. And the costs for the inspection and compliance are borne by the importer, so the shipping lines actually help pay for the Ministry of Primary Industries biosecurity program. Okay, you can go here to this URL here and look over these 6 most unwanted invasive marine organisms in New Zealand. These are most unwanted because of their high likelihood of arrival, their potential for significant spread, and their history of invasiveness overseas. And so you can read up a little bit about those, and those are something that you probably want to know a little bit about for the final exam.